to our program this afternoon, where we're going to focus on media coverage of the Keystone Pipeline. As I am sure most all of you are aware, this issue has captured a lot of the attention of those people who follow environmental issues, climate issues, energy issues, and also Canadian-U.S. issues. It has also split a lot of the interest groups, where the business interests have argued that this is going to be an enormous catalyst for jobs, and the environmental, many of the environmental groups have argued that this is a litmus test as to whether this country and this president is going to be serious about the climate issue. And we've got a terrific panel, and I'm going to turn it over to Chris Russell. Those of you not familiar with Chris, for more than 20 years, covered science and technology issues for the Washington Post, is one of the most highly respected journalists covering these issues in the country, where she's been very involved with a number of the key associations dealing with this issue over the last few years. And for 5 years, she has been a fellow here at the Belfer Center, and has been developed a growing program looking at how the media covers energy and environmental issues. And for those of you who are first-year students and are coming back next year, I would strongly urge you to look at her course. There's been nothing but enthusiasm from anyone who has taken it. So with that, let me turn this over to Chris.
Thank you. Thanks, Henry. Actually, I think we should stop right there. That was an excellent introduction. In fact, this seminar today did grow out of this class earlier this semester on media, energy, and environment. And as our last exercise, we did a simulation on Keystone XL with different students playing all of the different role plays that are involved. And certainly it does present all of the issues that Henry represented. And also the Obama card. Just today I saw yet another framing of this, rock in a hard place, and so on. So time is moving on, and I would say that it's not hard to find news coverage on an hourly, daily basis. Somewhat conveniently for this seminar today, the EPA weighed in on this this week, early this week, saying there was insufficient evidence presented in the State Department Environmental Impact Statement. And not surprisingly, all of the usual players have weighed in on that, including Canada and TransCanada raising Canadian sovereignty issues, and the environmental groups saying, now Obama had no choice but to postpone this. And so I don't know if anybody in the room wants to bet on the time in which this decision is going to be made. We can probably guess, based on when the environmental impact statement was released on a Friday at 5 o'clock, that it might be released, July 4th, mid-weekend, in hopes of disguising it. But there well could be further things that postpone the issue. And as I say, the media coverage has really been all over the map, as I'm sure all of you have seen. It's really been very hard, as this Huffington Post, which has been fairly opinionated on the green side of it, Keystone XL facts plenty to feed opposing opinions. And so today we are going to try to examine the media role in the larger sense of the public discussion, how the different constituencies have weighed in on this and made Keystone such a big issue, a symbolic issue, and at the same time, with the experts at the table, try to actually go back to some of the substance of what does Keystone matter in terms of energy and environment. So I am absolutely sure that they are ready to answer all of those questions so that we can get to the discussion with you, the audience. I'm sure everybody in this room has memorized where the pipeline is, but if you haven't seen it, it is the orange part. The underlying network is existing pipelines, and we've certainly, also with the Arkansas spill, recently has elevated this issue in the news. And in fact, last week there was a Pulitzer Prize for Inside Climate News, which is a small startup, strong environmental orientation, and they won a Pulitzer for their coverage of the Michigan oil spill. So there's not a shortage of media coverage. There may be a shortage of media coverage that actually explains the situation. But we're talking about 1,179 miles, 36-inch diameter, and 830,000 barrels of oil per day. Those may be the only facts on which we can agree. Although I'm going to urge this may be a panel that agrees more than normal. So we're going to start with Michael Levy, who is a senior fellow at the Council on Foreign Relations. He is the author, this is the paid announcement, of this new book, The Power Surge, Energy Opportunity and the Battle for America's Future, which is coming out as we speak. It is, in fact, there are some signed copies, courtesy of his running skills in between, in the last hour down to the coop as instructed by the coop. So there are copies at the coop, and I think it really is an engaging book which deals with larger issues, some of which the Keystone controversy touches on, and there are flyers for his book. He has widely been on the media side. I'm not sure he wants to join us and call himself a member of the media, but like many experts, he is a blogger and someone who is very interested in communicating to the public. He's going to be followed by David Keith, who is an environmental science engineer, public policy guru, and also a Canadian. Actually, I learned at lunch that Michael has lived in Vancouver, correctly, so there's a secret. Anyone else here from Canada? All right, the Secret Canada Club has arrived. Anyway, David is currently a Harvard University professor of public policy at the Kennedy School, and he is also in applied sciences, or applied physics, I guess, at Harvard College in the engineering school. He has been called one of Time Magazine's Heroes of the Environment 2009, and he has really worked at this unusual interface between science, policy, technology, innovation, and has really been speaking and has a book coming out on geoengineering. So watch this space. Next fall, we'll get him on geoengineering. Finally, Ilana Shore is an energy reporter who actually knows quite a bit about this. She's written literally hundreds of articles, maybe like 500, for Greenwire, which is a Washington, D.C. Online publication published by E&E Publishing. This year she's up at MIT as a Knight Science Journalism Fellow, and we brought her to the class to explain Keystone, and she did an excellent job talking about some of the finer distinctions in the media coverage. So in the limited time, each of them is going to make some opening remarks about the issue, how well the media has done, and some of the questions about who's hyping what and how the different players on both the pro and anti sides have been capturing the public attention and putting pressure on you-know-who, Obama and his dilemma. So we'll start with Michael.
Thanks, Chris. Thanks for having me here.
Can I say one more thing? We are taping.
Okay.
And so,
Is there a microphone we should be speaking into so that this picks it up?
I think we're okay, but if anybody can't hear, we do have a mic, so wave at us if you need that. But be aware that you will be taped in terms of questions. Go ahead.
Chris,
Great.
he was talking about the camera.
Well, if the camera's picking up our voices, then we're good. But
Yeah.
So I don't want to disappoint you right up front, but there's disagreement as to whether it actually carries 830,000 barrels a day. At least of whether that is oil or whether you should only count a fraction of that because it's bitumen diluted with something else. So pretty much everything can be contested in this space. If there's one lesson from the last few years of this debate, it's that no one agrees on anything. Chris asked me to talk a bit about the substance as a useful foundation for the discussion. I'll do that, and I'll talk a little bit about how this became a political story, and about a few thoughts about how the media has covered it. But I want to start by saying briefly how I got involved in this issue. In 2008 or 2009, I became frustrated that there was one world that thought about security and economics, and another world that thought about climate, and I figured particularly on the security meets climate issues, it would be nice to think about how you look at the picture coherently. And when I want to drill down on attention, I like to pick a particular issue, a particular subject or decision to focus on, because I find it clarifies thinking. So I did a small study on the Canadian oil sands, looking at how you might handle the tension between energy security and climate change. And I concluded that it was overblown on both sides. This was before the Keystone Pipeline was a big fight, but that the fight over the oil sands, particularly from a US perspective, was broadly overblown. That the economic benefits and security benefits that a lot of people had touted were overstated, but that the climate damages were also greatly overdone in many quarters. And what I found around my work was that people would say things like, the Council on Foreign Relations is now working on very important issues like the Canadian oil sands. And they didn't mean that in a serious way. It was a marginal issue. It was not something that you thought of as a first-tier policy issue. It was not a second-tier policy issue. And yet, within 2 years, it was a front-page story. It was something where if you have a Google alert on the Keystone XL pipeline, you get a dump of articles every day, and it's usually quite long.
Do not do that, by the way. Someone who gets these all day long, but anyway.
Yeah, so it's extraordinary. And so the big question is, how did this become such a big story and end up being part of our energy discussion the way it did? I want to step back, though, first and say something about the facts. And I want to start with climate change. When the Keystone discussion began, it was about the relative carbon intensity of the Canadian oil sands. So to produce oil from the oil sands, it takes a lot of energy. And so the emissions involved in that production part of the process are 2 or 3 times as large as they are for conventional oil. Now, most of the emissions involved in producing and using oil don't come when you produce it, they come when you use it. So when you put this all together end to end, and people call this sort of wells to wheels emissions, Canadian oil sands, depending on what you're measuring relative to and on the particular source within Canada, somewhere between 5 and 20% more carbon intensive than the typical barrel of oil. Now, if that's what you're focused on and you're asking, what does substituting Canadian oil sands crude for some other source do to global emissions, you come to the conclusion that it adds somewhere around 0.1% or maybe less to global emissions. Okay, so not the kind of world-changing discussion that you might infer from some of the conversations. In order to push this up to another level as a matter of substance, you have to focus on these full end-to-end emissions and ask, well, what happens if the oil that comes out of Canada doesn't just replace oil from somewhere else, but supplements it, so that the world ends up using more oil in total, and we have to count those complete emissions from end to end. And I'll come back to that in a second, but first, that's probably not the most likely case. Because of how the global oil market works and because of how countries make decisions about how much oil to produce. But even if you include that, you're talking about 1 percentage point, maybe 2, if you're not only looking at the pipeline, but at all Canadian oil sands expansion down the road. So this is not, as a matter of substance, a world-changing thing. Obviously, every piece of emissions matters, and it's a slippery slope to just say that any particular chunk is too small to worry about. But if you were to just step back and say, is this the one thing that you would have predicted or would have wanted to grab policymakers' attention? It's unlikely that it would be. I'll also just say, at the beginning of this discussion, this was not even driven all that much by climate change. To the extent that environmental groups were focused on the Canadian oil sands, it was about the local impacts in Alberta. And that applies to US environmental groups too. The focus on climate was because that's where the US leverage was, and US groups wanted to focus on where the US leverage was. But again, I think to understand where folks come to this from, you need to have that part of the puzzle. Let's talk a bit also about the facts on economics and security. For the same reason that you're unlikely to add a lot to emissions by boosting oil sands production because it mostly substitutes for other sources, you're also unlikely to do much to oil prices. If adding Canadian oil mostly displaces other oil, then total global production doesn't increase by much and prices don't need to drop by much to get people to consume that extra oil. So when you look at typical modeling exercises, additional oil sands production affects the price of a barrel of oil by an amount in the order of dimes rather than dollars. Okay, so pretty small impacts. On the security side, a lot of the obsession with having oil from a friendly source, I think, is more appropriate to the world oil system of the 1970s than to today's oil market. Our economy is vulnerable today not because a bad guy is going to stop selling us oil, but because events on the other side of the world can cause prices to skyrocket. We are vulnerable as consumers, even if we were to produce all of our own oil, and it's that danger of price spikes that matters. When things went haywire in Libya a couple years ago, the price of Canadian oil went up by more than the price of oil from the United States. By more than the price of oil from the Middle East. Okay, so this doesn't provide us some sort of special security against our biggest security issues associated with oil. The other basic observation that I'll make on the economics and security side is that if you want to tweak the assumptions in order to project that Canadian oil will have a large price impact, you have to say that this will be additional to other oil. And if you believe that, then you also have to believe that the climate impacts will be larger than mainstream predictions are. You can't push the climate impacts up without also pushing the economic benefits up. The two go hand in hand because they both correspond to how much oil you add in total to the world market. So given all this, why are we talking about the Keystone XL pipeline? Why has this become such a big story? And I think you have to look at the moment at which this emerged, and that's the summer of 2011 for the most part. What's happening then? First, people focused on climate change are extraordinarily frustrated. Okay, you had the Copenhagen conference come and go, and though some of us actually think it was a constructive meeting, the general view is that it's a total disaster. And among the most enthusiastic folks who were focused on getting a global treaty, it certainly is seen as a disaster. You have cap and trade, which people had really been hoping to have go through, and which was being pushed on not a fully bipartisan basis, but with support from industry, from some parts of industry, from environmental groups, and some support from both sides of the aisle, fell apart. And people were looking for some different way to approach things. And the Keystone Pipeline, I think, along with the sort of fight over fracking, provided an opportunity to get back to the basics of what environmental groups were used to doing, which is focusing on concrete local impacts. Keystone allowed you to talk about Nebraska, leveraging existing law and regulation in order to mobilize local opposition to activities rather than trying to pass new laws, and it was really in folks' wheelhouse at a time where they wanted a win and they wanted something to galvanize attention. I think it's also worth putting this in the context of the other big social thing that was happening at the time, which was Occupy Wall Street. If you look at the rhetoric from people who organized the Keystone protests at the beginning, there's a lot of rhetoric that suggests being very much informed and sort of excited by the fact that Occupy Wall Street and related efforts were able to get people out on the street and excited about something. And I think that mobilized a lot of folks. But the last piece, and I think this is critical to our discussion with the media, is that the strategy was all about the media. The goal of the big protests in 2011 and the efforts to get arrested outside of the White House was to get this thing on the front page of the newspaper and to get people talking about it as a result. So the media focus on Keystone XL is not a sort of side effect of the fight over it. It's at the core of the fight over the pipeline because it's a big part of what the strategy, I think, for the groups opposed to the pipeline was. Let me make a few quick observations on how the media has handled things in the few years. in the couple years since then. And the first thing to observe is that few people in the media cover this issue in all of its dimensions. So it's covered as a political story, or it's covered as a business story, or it's covered as an environment story. It's not covered comprehensively in a way that allows you to see different aspects of the issue. And in that way it reflects our much broader social approach to energy issues, whether it's in universities or whether it's in society, whether it's in the business world. We don't tend to have discussions of energy and environment that really pull these pieces together. The second thing that I know I've observed is a strong return to a he said, she said approach to covering climate issues. And people focused on climate change for a long time pushed really hard to get away from he said, she said, particularly on climate science. And the Keystone fight has gotten back to that. I remember being quoted in an article where I said some things that might be positive toward pipeline supporters and some that might be negative. It was a long article, and the first part was framed as Keystone Pipeline supporter Michael Levy, and the second part was framed as Keystone Pipeline opponent Michael Levy. Okay, so there's a lot of confusion out there, and people have a hard time sort of seeing that there can actually be facts as opposed to viewpoints that one uses to bolster a particular political stance. And I say this is bad enough on the climate side, but particularly bad on the economics and security part of the equation. There's an enormous amount of, some say this will create 30 jobs, some say it will create 200,000 jobs, where there actually is truth. There might not be precise truth, but there are some things that you can at least say are wrong. Last observation, we have this public fight over the Keystone XL pipeline, but in a lot of ways it's a proxy for a much bigger fight that has intensified over the last couple years, particularly with rising US production of oil and gas. That's coincided with intensifying fears about climate change. And it's a fight over whether more oil is a good thing or a bad thing. That is at the root of a lot of these debates. We talk about details of pipelines and spills and what is the emissions intensity of Canadian oil, but a lot of the time what we're really fighting over is whether we want more oil production or less oil production. And once the Keystone pipeline is behind us and we actually have that debate, it'll be all the more important that it is a well-informed one.
Thanks. Thank you very much for doing this. I should probably say a couple more words about myself because they're relevant here. I mostly live in Calgary, Alberta. I run a startup company there. That's right now 60% of my employment, 40% is Harvard. I'm graduating today over the weekend. I run a green tech startup company, and one of my funders and friends is the richest guy in town who's made his money by being extraordinarily smart and intelligent. I want to say a little bit, first of all, just about sort of framing to what extent Keystone matters for climate. So how do we interpret this kind of wild difference between claims that it's game over for the planet on the one hand, Jim Hanson's claim, or the kind of views that this is just a normal pipeline decision? So I think you've got to be clear about what the counterfactual is. So let me try this a couple different ways. So one way is to say, suppose there was no climate. Suppose climate was not a policy issue or a science issue, it didn't matter. And the question was simply, what would be the impacts on carbon emissions of turning Keystone on or off? Let's say it was going to be turned down for some totally other reason, procedural reason, or to do with local impacts. The short answer is, under those assumptions, which are not the assumptions we live under completely, but under those assumptions, the direct impact of turning down Keystone would be very close to zero. There's lots of other ways to get oil out of there. Right now, my neighbors in Calgary are desperately concerned about the relatively low prices they're getting for bitumen because it's hard to get it out. And they're working all sorts of ways to get it down, of which this is just one. There is a whole lot of oil moving by rail. There are accelerated, or bitumen moving by rail. There are accelerated ideas about moving by rail. There's talk about a big pipeline all the way to eastern Canada. There's Gateway, which I think probably will get blocked actually for separate Canadian internal reasons, which would be a pipeline to the middle part of the British Columbia coast. There's a separate pipeline which will go to the southern British Columbia coast, which will probably get approved. Bottom line is that you just imagine, normal operations, you just remove Keystone, the net effect on emissions will be too small to measure. That is not a central thing that drives how quickly the oil sands operations grow or not. So, in a narrow sense, you could say that the statements that people like Hansen have made that it's game over for the planet if we approve it are just, in a sense, laughable on their face in interpret it narrowly. So environmental strategy and tactics. It's a fact that many of the issues that have been talked about, the Polagala aquifer, the fact that it runs over that aquifer, the ducks and the tailing ponds, which are just bigger issue in Canada than here, the tailing ponds themselves, which look pretty ugly, are not, as objective measures, very serious environmental problems. So I live in Alberta. I think a lot about the environmental impacts. And if you ask me what I actually care about there and what my friends who run Nature Conservancy or Pembina, the biggest environmental groups who I go hunting with and hang out with, those guys are desperately concerned, as am I, about natural gas development in Mountain Front, which is hideous. And even one of the leading Alberta politicians who almost became Prime Minister and I agree that if we could make some grand trade, we'd shut down a bunch of natural gas development in Mountain Front, which is enormously destructive.
Sorry, where?
In the mountain, along the mountain spine, which is the land we most want to protect. And the oil sands are very destructive but in a very small and contained area. So if you just asked about kind of local land use, you choose oil sands over gas. Does that mean the oil sands opponents are just dumb? Keystone opponents? I don't think so. Strategy does not equal tactics. And people do not say what they mean. And that doesn't mean they're dumb, and it doesn't mean they're venal, it just means they're normal political actors who know what they're doing. So many of the biggest US NGOs, who I also work with and talk with a lot, who oppose Keystone, I think actually have a very valid strategic reason to do it. Whether or not ultimately it was the right thing to do, I have a lot of questions about, but it's not a dumb reason, and that's the strategic reason is quite independent from particular things they may say, like the pipeline is going to be a risk to the aquifer, which it's not, because land-based pipelines are just not a big environmental risk. The reason that they're doing that is because all else equal, I'd say we, me as somebody who's worked on climate for 25 years, who would really like to see us cut carbon emissions, if you block a major new source of unconventional oil like that, you all else equal slightly increase the prices of fuel over the next decades. Just a little bit, it's at the margin, but all else equal, that helps you get alternatives in, and it helps keep that carbon in the ground. And so there's a very coherent reason why you do that. But the fact is, talking about climate doesn't get much play. So you're not going to go say that publicly because it doesn't work. You're going to go do all these procedural things, just as you said. They're in their wheelhouse, they're the local fights that you think you can do because you think it will work. Whether in the kind of meta strategy this is good is unclear because I would guess it would probably be a group. I don't know. That certainly would have been my very strong guess a few months ago. And so the question of whether it's good for them to lose a fight like that, you can actually spin both ways. The people in the environmental community will look at that both ways. Not clear. There are sort of games within games here. I think what's true is that if you talk with people privately inside the big NGOs, they don't disagree with the basic statement that this pipeline on its own is sort of irrelevant. They know that. They're not dumb. Let me say a few things about Canada. This could not be a bigger issue in Calgary, obviously. And it is by no means clear what impact it would have to have it turned down in the real world. So I started by saying that in a world where climate was no issue and you just kind of removed that and everything else was the same, it wouldn't make much difference. That's true. That's not the world we're in. I would say that oil sands investment is at some risk right now. And to be clear, I would like to have no oil sands investment in the long run because I would like to not be putting carbon on the ground. But investment's at a risk because there's lots of oil on this planet. And the capital costs of executing those projects have crept up and up. And they haven't gone down as much during the downturn as people hoped. And so with a very high capex to execute, people are marginal. And they get more marginal as there's more oil around. And so it doesn't take much to shut off the flow of new projects. I mean, stopping the projects that are in the ground would be extraordinarily hard because the marginal costs are quite low. Remember, like Shell and some of the big guys who are now in went in. They went in at a WTI target price of $22 a barrel. So there's no question they can produce oil and make money once they got the capital in the ground. The issue is about getting new capital in the ground. And I think that, in fact, if Keystone was canceled, it would be a real signal, not just the Calgary community ultimately doesn't play the strings, but to the investment community who puts the capital in and allows them to build it. And I think it's quite possible it actually would not have some significant development out of oil sands. Not what the EPA says, because of the reality of people's expectations about future decisions and the guess around why it was made. There is a real Canadian pushback, and it's articulate and it's not stupid. Ezra Levant has been very effective in Canada talking about ethical oil, arguing that Americans are really off their political rocker by opposing oil, which is made with quite high local labor standards and quite high environmental standards compared to other oil that gets imported to America, like oil from Nigeria. And that argument, I think, is fair, except it does ignore the climate. But on all those other things, it's completely fair. I think one last thing where I think the two sides don't talk to each other, and I'll stop here, is there's a very widely seen view inside Alberta. This is sort of, I would guess, irrelevant to most people, about what we Albertans need to do to get our social license to grow. Because I have both citizenships, but my kids are there, I primarily live there right now. And there's a view that if we do other nice green stuff in Alberta, like invest in solar plants, that somehow then we'll be seen to be nice green people and people will be happy to take our oil sands. And I think that is completely, I make it sound, I mean, I see some smiles. There is no question that Alison Redford, the Premier, and a bunch of the elite really think that's true. And when she came to Washington a few weeks ago, she really said it, and she really believes somehow that if we just do a little bit better, we're going to have this $40 ton carbon tax and have this other stuff that's kind of good policy in Alberta. That somehow by, and not all of it's, some of that good policy is really a hoax, but other parts are actually not, they are pretty good policy. But I don't think it makes any difference to the opponents who don't want Keystone, because the reasons they don't want it have nothing to do with the actual environmental impacts or how green or not green the Alberta government is. And so there's a way in which there is a complete disconnect between the way a bunch of my neighbors in the elite rich part of Canada see this problem and the way their opponents see it or people south of the border here see it. And I think that's bad, because it's hard to cut good deals in places where the two sides really are not hearing each other.
Could you add one comment just about the public dialogue in terms of the media and the megaphone effect, particularly Canada versus the U.S.?
Something incendiary? I mean, I guess I would say the media's done an excellent job of being spun by both sides, which is sort of its job, I suppose. I mean, if you think the media's job was actually to write balanced pieces that illuminated the big story, I'd say it hasn't done such a good job. But maybe that's not its job. I don't know.
Well, we're going to turn to Ilana, but I was a little worried when you said that the environmental groups weren't dumb, but I felt that dumbness hanging in the air.
No,
vis-a-vis the media.
I think these issues of strategy versus tactics don't come out very well.
No, I'm talking about the media.
No,
it's
in
been
a
done.
way the media.
Yeah.
If I can totally exempt myself, I couldn't agree more with that assessment of the media. But I mean, so maybe a good way to start would be to explain how I came to this issue. I was a political reporter for almost 6 years before I came to my newsroom, which is mostly subscription only, so you've probably never heard of it, but we do release some of our content to the public. And what we specialize in is, we're called kind of a sexy trade publication, because we put some political spin on the ball. We try to tell you policy details in a way that is accessible and also political. So that's why I got hired, and early 2010, right after the BP spill, an editor drops a Keystone XL document on my desk and says, "What is this about? Why is John Tester upset about the steel on this pipeline? You're obsessed with pipelines, go look at it." And this was, BP was the big story, and I was like, "Oh, really? You're making me do this boring pipeline instead of the oil spill?" So I fall down a rabbit hole that becomes my entire life. Just get completely passionate about this pipeline, about pipeline regulation in general, and watch in, frankly, kind of awe myself as it becomes, in the summer of 2011, a big deal. But to talk about the media specifically and the way my colleagues treat this issue, I've been really fortunate to get this year out of the newsroom, out of the deadline cycle, to really talk to experts like Professor Keefe and others at this school about the science. Truth is, the media is squashed. We're racing to, beat each other on Twitter by 15 seconds with things that aren't really news. There's all this incentive for us to not interrogate the science and, to be spun, because frankly, Keystone XL is at this point little different from other issues, from the war to healthcare, in which the media were incentivized to kind of mistake rhetorical and political power for real authority. Because it's readable when we do so. And the fact is that the NGOs who oppose this, who I kind of agree with Professor Keefe, secretly know that substantively the impact is not great, have a ton of rhetorical and political power based on this issue. They've done an incredible job organizing and mobilizing. And that's a fact, and that's a good, big political story. But in my business, it's very difficult to put that in the context of what the project actually means, because it involves some thorny questions. I mean, yeah, there's a debate over whether all 830,000 of those barrels is oil, but having read, I'm sorry to say, all of the environmental impact statement, the company reveals it doesn't even have all those barrels contracted. So at this point, it's more like 700,000 barrels.
How many hours did that take for that reading? Just
We're
in
talking
case anyone wants to.
Probably like 24 to 34 hours. No, sadly not.
Get these better eyeglasses payments or something?
So there's that, right? I mean, but that's a fact that you would only know because it's in like Appendix C. Somebody like me is really fortunate, and I respect a lot of colleagues who've done some really bad journalism on this pipeline under a lot of pressure. Okay, so let's go back to how do we separate the science from the politics and also try to combine it. Coming off of cap and trade, I never covered international climate talks, but I am a Capitol Hill person, so I know very deeply how devastating it was for the mainline environmental groups to lose on that fight. You have within the environmental movement right now an increasing schism between the old line guys who really staked a lot of inside the Beltway power on this climate bill that failed, and the new line guys, the Bill McKibbins, the ones who pushed divestment on college campuses such as Harvard. Michael Brune, who came to the Sierra Club in early 2010, just when I was starting to cover this story. He comes from a civil disobedience activism background at the Rainforest Action Network. So you're seeing the environmental movement sort of open itself up to this old school, new school battle that's a political and scientific story. And that to me can't be discounted in terms of the way the media looks at this, because those are the guys talking to us. It's not often academics and energy experts at CFR, it's those guys in Washington who are putting it at this point one foot in each of these worlds. And Keystone XL was this perfect opportunity to get the Environmental Defense Fund, seen as very corporate in the environmental world, and Bill McKibben, together in front of the White House, chaining themselves to the gates. So they were pretty proud of that, and the media listened because, again, of our incentives to cover a great, sexy political story. But let's steer back to the science for a second. Pipeline regulation and the rules of what it takes to build a pipeline in America, very little understood. I was also paying attention to the BP spill, so I can say that because the Obama administration was obviously quite publicly embarrassed in throwing its weight behind reforming the Minerals Management Service into what it became now, there were a lot of people who were willing to call reporters and say, here's what MMS was, and here's what Boomer, that's the horrifying acronym that is the new MMS, does. They were all ready to talk to us about that.
Right, so even journalists go into all of these acronyms, so MMS.
Right, Minerals Management Service was the arm of the government that specifically regulated offshore drilling safety before the Macondo explosion. Boomer is called the Bureau of Oceans and Environmental Management. I don't even remember, you guys. How embarrassing is that? It's a terrible acronym. That is what MMS was turned into after Macondo. You had a lot of people willing to walk reporters through the arcane details of this. When it comes to pipelines, the entire budget of the Federal Pipeline Regulatory Agency would not buy you an F-22. It's tiny. There's 2 million plus miles of pipelines in this country, enough to circle the world more times than I can even count. So you're dealing with a huge mismatch on all fronts, not just actually going out and ensuring that the pipelines are safe, but explaining it to people in my profession. And as a result, you get a lot of people who don't understand what it means, who hear environmentalists say, oh my God, the Ogallala Aquifer is at risk, and there's nobody in the pipeline regulatory community who can explain to them how that's policed. So you begin to see how exaggeration, hyperbole based on the facts easily gets into the media. And I don't mean to be an apologist for journalists, only to explain to you sort of the landscape that went into a lot of not so great coverage of this issue. Now that said, what's unique about Keystone to me, and I speak as somebody who's spent a lot of time in Nebraska and who's talked to a lot of farmers and ranchers who were last week standing up for 17 hours bombarding the State Department, they're getting terrible information too. I feel actually a huge kinship with these ranchers because they're being told by environmentalists that they're drinking water and might be poisoned and their cows might die. And just like Mike's explanation about the barrels of oil and that Keystone XL is unlikely to be supplemental oil rather than replacing other sources, that's really unlikely. Yes, it could happen. Geologically, it's conceivable that there's a spill. I've seen the water table in Nebraska. Yes, there could be a plume. Even pro-TransCanada paid geologists acknowledge that. Super small likelihood. big enough likelihood to scare the heck out of some ranchers in Nebraska, and again, carve out some huge political space. So you see what's going on here. There's a lot of bogus info out there, and it's really difficult. It takes a huge time investment to be able to set the record straight. But one thing I will say about the politics that Professor Keith mentioned, I completely agree that Canada is going to Washington and telling reporters and anyone who listen that their green credibility could be bolstered through other means. You also see them on Earth Day starting an environmental monitoring database for the oil sands, which is of a piece with this. Like, yes, if you let us develop this more, we're going to just throw a ton of monitoring data at you because we are very transparent, love us. It's working on some level, but I agree ultimately it is not viable as a strategy. There are a lot of people in Congress right now who are perceiving a quote-unquote trade with the environmentalists as a viable strategy. Namely, if Obama approves this pipeline, and although I am objective to a fault, I do believe that is the likely outcome here, that he can somehow offer Bill McKibben and company a trade. I'll come down hard on fracking in specific ways that I wasn't before if you guys can kind of take this lump. The environmentalists wised up after cap and trade. They wised up after the ozone regulations that were dropped on Labor Day in 2011 when they were busy celebrating CAFE standards. They're not going to be pleased with any trade. It's a political headache for the president, and I think attempting to buy them off, so to speak, for lack of a nicer way to put it, is probably misguided, and I believe the White House is actually, they know that. They might try it anyway, and they might try to explain it to the media, but they know that because they've been told. One metric that I would love to get the two experts here talking about that I feel like is actually the best understanding of why the oil sands might be negative is something called energy return on investment. In my studies here, although the climate impact of this pipeline is terrible, the energy return on investment, namely the actual societal benefit from sort of expending the energy on this for the oil sands is on the low end of what some scholars think is viable. It's 5 to 6 to 1.
I should care about that because the world is short of energy. It's not the least relevant metric I can possibly think of.
Why?
Right, so and I have the same.
Okay, maybe we, is this?
Let me try something else.
Okay.
Yeah, that one's so.
Because we
No, I want to know why.
I would say that I do think a trade. I personally hope for a trade, and I think that a trade could be credible for a bunch of the core of the environmental community. I think that if the Obama administration used EPA authority to do something serious on regulating coal plants, which is actually the most important single thing you would do to make progress both on climate and on the related health impacts, then I think a big chunk of the mainstream environmental community, whom I would count myself in many ways, would be really happy. And to be clear, I'm very happy to have more people chain themselves to Keystone to keep the pressure on so we can get more trades in the future, even though I don't think Keystone is a serious problem. So I do think a trade like that, if it was real, fracking is again a kind of issue that's not really much of an issue, but I do care about climate. I spent my whole career working on it, and I think if we can get a real trade that got something more than otherwise would have happened, a significant amount of coal plants, I think there'd be a lot of people who
I haven't
talked to a single environmentalist though who doesn't believe, and they are true, this is true, they're legally required under the Clean Air Act and given Massachusetts for speed to do this. So that's not perceived as a trade, that's perceived as something they have to do anyway.
So can I pick up on this question of a trade, and then I'm sure you have things you want us to talk about. The problem with the idea of a trade is that everything you might ask for in a trade is something that the Obama administration already wants to do, including Clean Air Act regulations on existing power plants. These are things that are being pursued because the administration wants to deal with climate change. Just like they went after cap and trade, they will go after Clean Air Act regulations. Just like they did Clean Air Act regulations on cars and on future power plants now being revised, they will go after this. And so it makes it difficult to have a real trade in that sense. You can have a perceived trade. They can allow people to they can frame things in a way that allows some folks to climb down, claim a victory, and not suffer a defeat after having put themselves up there. The real trade, if there is anyone out there, and I don't think it's an explicit trade, but it's about the atmosphere, is a yes on the pipeline and a reduced chance that that Clean Air Act authority gets stripped by Congress. Okay, so the Supreme Court did not rule that there is a constitutional requirement to regulate carbon dioxide emissions. It ruled that given the existence of the Clean Air Act, you had to look at regulating carbon dioxide emissions. But there's no constitutional requirement that the Clean Air Act exists in the form it currently exists. Now, I'm not suggesting that if he says no to the pipeline, they'll automatically get rid of the Clean Air Act authority, or if he says yes, it'll automatically stick around. But I do think this affects that atmospherics. Most people don't study the individual sections of the Clean Air Act and think in detail about whether they like this regulation or that regulation. They say, are the guys making these rules people who I trust on these issues? Do I think that when the president and the administration, the EPA, make new rules on coal-fired power plants, that they're out to stop fossil fuel development, or are they out to change the course of how our energy system works? What's their attitude? Do they care about my job? Those are the things that people use to interpret these decisions, and the decision on the pipeline will affect how people interpret these other things, and will affect that political environment. So that's part of why I say why I agree with you, David, that these groups are involved not just in sort of engineering the pipeline, but in broader strategy. But what I haven't seen is a coherent argument about why politically this expands the space for people in the middle to act rather than contracting the space. And I wish that the political media, at least, because that is a political story, push them more to talk about it.
Well, 'cause I mean, I've talked about it with them. I don't think that's their goal at all. I agree with you. I think their entire goal is to play the Tea Party for the left and move this entire debate to be more liberal.
I mean, there's so many issues, and this is an important one. And just so I can weigh in on the trade, I mean, there are people who think in Washington who are perhaps cynical in the sense that they have assumed that it is going to be approved, and so this does give cover to the Obama administration to take some other actions. And so it may, again, may be an unspoken, or it may be actually spoken, because there's a lot of things spoken in Washington that don't get in the news, and there has been a lot of talk in political stories about the trade. So I think just one other thing on the language that we're using.
Yeah.
I think what bothers me the most about the coverage, again, is this he said, she said, but kind of lumping everybody together. And so we see, the environmental groups, as if that is one, they all get together and they agree. We see the administration. Well, obviously the agencies have a lot. We see the Congress. So particularly the group that seems not to have even been discussed is really the pro-pipeline economy jobs argument, which again, the facts, are such that the job estimates are exaggerated. But I think, if the people in this room are not representative sample, but if you're looking at the American public, which according to the latest poll is generally in favor of this, a lot of that has to do with this jobs argument. But then finally, so I'd like to hear a little bit about that framing of the story as jobs, economy, and then finally one other request. The media is, we are all talking about it, but the media is a plural word, not a singular word. And so the diversity of the media, again, there's television, there's the visual media, there's the social media, there's the mainstream media. So I think the media of all of these is the most diverse and also having the most trouble getting its arms around complicated issues. So I guess first, if we could talk about the framing of the jobs economy side of it to the public, not just to, and again, Obama and the administration are going to be reacting to perceived public opinion as well as all of these other political pressures. So if we talk about the public a little bit, and particularly the pro-Keystone public jobs crowd.
I think there's an aspect of this as a leading indicator. Just as I said that, if there was no climate, you just remove that pipeline, nothing else happened, it basically has no impact. But in practice, it might have an impact if you were to turn it down, because it's a leading indicator of future decisions. I think the same thing is true on jobs. So people who want to see greater focus on employment probably agree that the actual number of jobs from just this thing is small, but a decision to turn it down would be seen as a leading indicator that the administration was going to make more trade-offs that were less friendly to near-term employment and more friendly to climate.
So, I think there has been coverage of the pipeline on the jobs front. It's been anecdotal, right? Yeah. So there are plenty of people who go and talk to someone who might be involved in steel making for the pipeline and whatever it is. There has been, I know there are two issues.
No, I was just going to say, I wasn't saying it wasn't covered.
Yeah.
I was saying that we weren't discussing it here. So
Right.
there's been a lot of coverage of it. So
I actually think there's been very poor coverage of what's actually true and what's not. Again, there's been a lot of storytelling, but there's been very little coverage of what's true and what's not. And I'll leave it to others to talk about what the internal media incentives are on that. But I would just say that if you want to write a story about what's true and what's not, it's not clear at all who you would call. You might call me, because I've written a bit about it and about why this or that estimate is true, but for the most part, either you've got some guy contracted by one of the companies who says that there are going to be 200,000 jobs, or you've got someone in the environmental community who's setting up this sort of ridiculous false thing about how if we approve the pipeline, we won't have green jobs, and that this is the choice you must make about the future of the economy. So it's really hard to do a meaningful story on the economic side. Part of me wonders whether that, at least in the climate world, whether that's part because reporters are so used to sort of the crutch of, if it's not peer-reviewed, it's a controversy. Okay? So if you want to write something about, think about it this way. If you're writing about the climate side of this, for quite a while it was he said, she said on Game Over and whatnot, even though serious people could tell you exactly what was up, until someone wrote a paper about saying totally obvious things in Nature, or Nature climate change. And then this got reported as, okay, now we have the answer. Oil sand's a much smaller deal than coal plants. This was not a revelation to anyone, but as soon as you put peer-reviewed on the thing, it got reported as fact. It was extraordinary, and you'll never get that in the economics world. And so to the extent that the climate reporting world has two categories, peer-reviewed and controversial, you're not going to get straight reporting on the economics of these things.
although would you say that the expert community has a bit sat on its hands? And I haven't seen as much participation from the kinds of experts who really could provide these answers. They're not, if you look at the media coverage, they're not as accessible. Now, someone like Alana gets to know the experts, but
how do you consider Jim Hansen not an expert on climate? He's the one who's saying this game over thing, and he's not referring just to the Keystone, he's referring to all of Alberta tar sands. It gets misquoted as saying Keystone equals game over, it doesn't, tar sands as a whole. But how do you consider Jim Hansen of NASA, the top climatologist, not an expert?
yeah, why don't you address that? But in fact, just the comment that you made about game over, again, one of the problems of things being repeated and repeated is this whole question about the impact has to do with how much you're taking out over what period of time and model.
Right.
And so I think in some of his roles, he is obviously one of the leading scientists and has been. He's recently been very frustrated, and he has become, by his own admission, a citizen scientist activist. So we have scientists and experts who wear two hats, but
well, I mean, it's also the degree to which that statement is a political statement versus a factual statement. Yes, he's factually referring to his assessment of the entire pool of Alberta.
Two degrees that everyone agrees on.
Sure, I mean, with the 535.
No, everyone doesn't agree on it.
At COP they did.
Well, everybody who's serious climate scientist, I can see another one shaking his head behind you, does not agree. So just state
But
the
to
facts.
finish my thought here, so you're that yes was referring to that politically. His game over quote is repeated by almost every environmentalist in Washington to refer to Keystone. That's a fact, and it's not connected to the truth. So that is where the problem gets created.
Well, I think there can be, of course, there's a political argument that, but tar sands does take us over the edge. I don't know what you're talking about. It just depends on how you
Tar
define
sands
it.
takes it over the edge if you exploit it all. in some world that is totally unrelated to, but so do many other pools of carbon.
Well, it's
just
the second
meaningless.
largest. It's not any other. It's
If
the
I
second
could
largest.
take the moderator's prerogative, we have a lot of people in the audience with a lot of opinions, and so if you might finish any other comments here, and then take individual questions that are not necessarily.
To make a quick comment though,
statements,
so, I mean, similar to this game over thing, the gigantic inflated jobs estimate that API and the oil industry has put out, 100,000 indirect and induced jobs, 20,000 direct jobs, that a lot of reporters quote. Again, that's comes from a study that has too many flaws to even list here. It would bore you, but a lot of reporters are incentivized to repeat it, just like a lot of reporters are incentivized to repeat the 35 permanent jobs number in the State Department's assessment. Now, I think an indirect induced number for what this pipeline would do is really, really difficult to come by because of what Professor Keith said, because it seems a leading indicator. It's going to incentivize some more refining investment down in the Gulf. I haven't seen a reliable, good economic study on what it would mean.
It would be very hard to know, because if you really turned it down and there really was a downturn in the oil sands development, which to be clear, I would like to have happen, there would be really big job impacts that would come. Much bigger than the pipeline load job impacts that would ripple from the Canadian economy to the U.S., because the supply chain for that expensive capital, which isn't the pipeline, expensive capital is the production capital, that supply chain is global and there's plenty in the U.S.
So what you can say, and this is true, is that if whatever the United States actually bottled that stuff up, then there would be an economic impact on the United States that would be much broader. It still wouldn't be the 200,000 thing, which requires you to make all sorts of ridiculous assumptions about North America being an isolated market from the rest of the world. So there are bounds you can put in it. You also asked about sort of diversity within the media.
Can I just interrupt for 1 second, because
Okay.
that's the ending question. I have, since we took one comment from the audience, I see
I have a
Dan
question,
Streich
actually.
in the back.
I have actually a question.
Okay.
Which is, I've always thought about the context, I've always thought this about what is the risk if Obama blocks the pipelines that might impact our long-term climate progress. And so the question is, what specifically, in terms of the calculus, I've always thought it's losing people like Mary Landrieu and sort of the conservative Democrats from protecting EPA rights, or EPA regulation of carbon. But are there any other things you think that might be lost if Obama turned down the pipeline?
So Dan, you missed my brilliant comment saying exactly what you just said.
It's basically, who's the trade
But-
actually with?
But I think you've got to also think about the near term and the longer term trades. So I think you described it correctly for the near term and its Clean Air Act authority, and it's not just conservative Democrats, but it's the broader atmosphere of this. Over the longer term, if the president is genuinely trying to help get people sort of believing I don't like all of the above, but he says all of the above, let's say most of the above, view of the future, then if you want to tell that story in a consistent and compelling way and get people to really buy into it and use that to mobilize support for a variety of things, whether it is expanding natural gas development or putting a price on carbon down the road, not in the next 2 years, then you actually got to stick to the script to a decent degree. And when you go out in the country and people say, well, I've heard the president is for all these things, but this Keystone pipeline, I don't get it. I don't get why he's against it and why he hates it. I mean, I'm not saying he does, but that's what they say. I think it really interferes with your ability to tell that compelling story that brings people along. I think that's a longer term project to get people to believe that that this is a story they can buy into.
Can we, before we open up more questions, can we just finish up with this diversity of the media and the question of, has anybody done, besides National
If I
Public
can
Radio?
just shoot one thing in there about the trade, because I remain unconvinced when it comes to political relations with the environmental movement. I agree with centrist Democrats, you're dealing in actual votes in the Senate. They think strategically in terms of a trade. I do not think 350 and increasingly Sierra and NRDC care about a trade or want a trade. What they actually can do is set more conditions in the final permit granted. You could call it a trade, or you could just call it better regulations on this pipeline that even a lot of pipeline supporters wouldn't mind as part of the State Department's final approval conditions. That's something that, so in other words, yes, we'll approve this pipeline, but we actually require that the emergency response plans be made public, because right now there's no rule like that in the law. Like literal things related to the operations that would essentially dare some of these local opponents to say, well, you really care about the farmers, the land, and the water? Here, we're giving you the most reliable way to actually take care of people on the route. I dare you to still oppose it. So that may still happen. I think it's really unlikely.
Well, let's assume, I mean, Bill McKibben and Jim Hansen don't care about those things.
They say they do. They say they do.
I know they don't.
I think
wait,
some of them do and some of them don't.
Okay, I am now
Yeah, some of them
actually
do.
calling some order here.
Okay.
If we could,
Yeah.
and we were afraid that everyone here would agree on everything, so that is the good news, is there's a lot of, and there is agreement, but
Pretty
a
strong
lot of
agreement.
energy. Since really we're not going to totally establish all of the pros and cons of the pipeline and all of the substance, and we've done a little of that, could we have a little bit of discussion about this public dialogue, which is symptomatic of the problems of dialogues on a lot of other complicated issues where they become too polarized opinions that really don't get covered as an issue. And again, which in the media has this been a television story? Who are they pitching the story to? And who's buying it hook, line, and sinker?
Stepping way back, in the end, society does need some kind of trade in the sense that there's wide agreement among some, but not all in the elite, that we should do something about climate, and pretty wide agreement that actually dealing with Keystone is not an effective thing to do about climate. So I think the function, to step to the back to the 20,000-foot level, the function of media in society should be to help this lubricate the dialogue in a useful way. So the dialogue, at some level, is about the stuff that really matters. It makes there more chance there actually would be a trade that makes sense. And I think in that sense, it's not working very well.
So to me, the media coverage would be good if it was using this as a teachable moment to get people to actually understand some of the issues. If this is symbolic, then it should also be something where we learn a bit. If I had to pick a news outlet, a sort of major news outlet that's covered it fairly well, it's probably the Times.
Yeah.
And not because they've had the one story that explains it all, but because everyone's been at it from every different angle in a way that at least collectively provides some illumination on the problem. And part is because they've been able to come back at this and back at this and back at this. Will that change now that they don't have an environment pod? Maybe, because it's going to be harder to sell these sort of stories internally. Though it's actually not been too hard to sell them within the business section. This isn't the other story about the media that we haven't really talked about. You mentioned in the opening, but I think is fascinating, is this Inside Climate. This little organization, I think it's called solveclimate.org. That's basically an activist organization that tells compelling stories. Went really hard after the diluted bitumen spill, I guess it was a couple years ago, and reported it out really well. Now, it was driven by a very clear activist agenda, but it reported it out extremely well. And a week or two ago, I guess last week, wins the Pulitzer Prize. I mean, that's a fascinating story to me. So it's not a Pulitzer Prize for opinion journalism. This is a Pulitzer Prize, I think it was for national coverage.
National reporting.
For national reporting. I find that extraordinary. I mean, it reflects a certain decision. And they did a real public service in that piece, in getting that information out there. But to sort of put that label on the broader organization, I think is an extraordinary decision. And if it says anything about where we're heading on journalism in this area, I think it's a very different world from what we've been used to.
Well, and a lot of, part of it, the problem is there is a huge media void where the mainstream media is not able to cover these stories in detail, and so.
I think your media coverage on the Keystone XL pipeline, to be blunt with you, is maybe like 40% inside climate news, like very hard. This is a huge climate issue. Leaning towards the sympathy with the game over attitude approach, sometimes really well reported, sometimes great read, but very slanted. 40% complete he said, she said, politics on the Hill, the facts are not there, and 20% people trying to do it right and sometimes failing. So that leads to a lot of confusion.
One thing, I've only read some of those stories, but my understanding is they're about the Enbridge spill, right? Yeah.
Well, no, some of the package was about Keystone.
Okay. But so let's assume all the reporting about the Enbridge spill was really high-quality investigative reporting. The issue that I would think we should be partly winning Pulitzer Prizes for is context. And the larger context is, while I certainly don't want to live beside a pipeline, I'm not trying to pretend that's a nothing story. If you step back and look at the big environmental problems we face, air pollution, large-scale water pollution, et cetera, pipeline spills on land are just not a big deal. That's not to say that Enbridge did a good job or that et cetera. And I think that context is something we ought to reward the news media for doing a good job of, for continuing to pull back and get people to think about what are, by basic measures we care about, the big environmental issues that matter and how do things rank.
Also, as a science reporter, I want to inject something and say that the crux of the Enbridge reporting, which is very relevant to Keystone, is the degree to which, this is an environmental argument, this particular heavy oil is more dangerous in a pipeline because it runs hotter, ergo creates more corrosion, and then a spill that's harder to clean up. That was the crux of the Pulitzer submission and the crux of a lot of the environmentalist complaints. I'm just one reporter, but I'm one who spends way too much time on this, and I have talked to a ton of scientists. There's no science out there that shows diluted bitumen is more corrosive in pipelines. Zero.
But are we really sure that's the environmental supplies? I talked to lots of senior people in the environmental community, and my sense is that is not what they care about. It's what more junior people say because of what seems to be effective at the moment.
There's a diversity of people who care about the pipeline.
Yeah,
that was
fair.
among the activist groups. That was what was so smart about the strategy in 2011. Both because it's compelling people, but also because, unlike with the climate piece, the jobs piece, where you at least can find someone who can give you the numbers, you inject a big piece of uncertainty into an area, A, where people don't really understand, and B, where most of the media is not going to spend the time to actually thoroughly understand. So it gets reported as a story about risks and unknowns rather than something that can actually be fully fleshed out.
But whether or not, Chris and I can disagree about to what role environmentalists are seizing on this argument. I would say after Arkansas, it's huge. But the point is the media has not covered it well at all. I mean,
Well, if you throw out the word bitumen, you're going to lose half of the media. So part of it, just to end this up, I think, is this, a person like Ilana is very rare. We have increasingly fewer science and energy environment specialty reporters, even at the New York Times, cutting back, Washington Post, big cutbacks. And so we are finding the struggle of people who are general assignment reporters taking this on. Why don't we take some questions, and if they could be short questions, and direct them at members of the panel, and let's not get into a debate as much as discussion of some of these issues about the public face of Keystone. Yes, Bill Hogan.
So, David, setting aside my revulsion at the ethical principle of you can say anything you want and you don't have to mean what you say, and that's the way to be effective in public. So setting aside the ethical foundations of that, I'd be interested in the effectiveness of that. So my concern would be that if I'm worried about the environment, and I think people making arguments for the environment that they don't believe and saying things which are not true, in the long run, makes it harder to deal with the problems of the environment. Now, it could be that maybe nobody ever remembers, and so all the talk is just talk and it doesn't matter, and we're all just yelling at each other. But I don't think that's true, and I think in the long run, you're better off to say what you mean and mean what you say.
I'm deeply worried about that. So I've talked to a bunch of students in the divestment movement and the people around Keystone. And I think that, there are people you talk to who say, especially people in divestment, who say, yeah, we get it, the divestment really won't do anything, but it'll start a social movement and that will somehow do something. And they don't necessarily fill in the dots in between. And the same is true about Keystone. People say, isn't it fantastic we've got all this energy going anti-Keystone? Yeah, you're right, David, it doesn't really make that much difference, but we've got this energy going that's going to sort of magically translate into action on stuff that we really care about, like cutting emissions. And I do think there is a chance that's true, first of all. As much as I don't like it, there's a chance it's true. But I think there's also a chance the environmental community will really weaken its credibility by fundamentally having not done what you say, saying what you mean and meaning what you say, by speaking in a way that's deeply confused and by just not being consistent about talking about what the real risks are.
Credibility with whom?
Good question. I mean, this presumes a model which may be old-fashioned and incorrect, that there is some kind of ill-defined, not a named list of kind of decision makers who help to influence policy, and that those decision makers' opinions matter are influenced by history like this and other people have done this.
Well,
Yeah, other
just
question.
to add real quickly, they'll also lose credibility by losing this battle. If Obama decides, as he probably will, to go ahead with the pipeline, and Obama being perceived widely and I think for the most part correctly as an environmentally strong president, there's a huge opportunity cost, I think, to this kind of nascent environmental movements focus on Keystone pipeline.
So there's an interesting feature of that. And when you look at how activist movements empower change, it's usually by creating space or pressure for a focus group that's a bit more toward the center to move forward. The peculiar thing about climate change is there isn't much of a group in the center that actually cares. I mean, this is an important distinction from a lot of other issues. And so when I think about the sort of landscape in the environmental world, what makes me worry about the sort of broader strategic consequences of what's happening with Keystone isn't that 350.org is out there protesting, and isn't that the Sierra Club is. I mean, there's a role in that sort of ecosystem. It's that every environmental group is on this. And it's not like they're opening space for this grand center. I mean, maybe they're opening space for the president, but the president is pretty lonely on these sorts of things. There isn't this big center of the road coalition, and ultimately, to actually do things on climate, you do need to do more than just leverage the Clean Air Act. And you do need to grow the set of people who care.
To provide a quick counterweight to that, though, and I completely agree with Michael that there's not much of a center politically, but I think I said this earlier in the panel, having talked to a lot of these guys, they see this as a Tea Party style operation where instead of appealing to the center, instead of crafting a coalition, they're taking the goalpost and they're moving it to the left. I mean, a specific quote from one of them to me just the other day. We see politically inviable things that are dictated by the science Jim Hansen gives us as the goal. I mean, there you have it. And you could say politically inviable things that are, okay, you could question that, and please, I welcome all questions of that approach, but that's what they're doing.
And to be fair, the mainstream kind of core, more centrist environmental movements had its chance at US CAP and didn't produce a rating. And so one thing I said when I spoke at the divestment rallies, I said, I don't really get the theory of change here, and I'm a little skeptical, but I think it's great that there's some energy, and my generation basically didn't figure out how to do this deal, and so I can't stand here and say, I know for sure this new strategy isn't going to work.
Question. I think you've had your hand up, yes.
Has there been any?
Can you identify yourself too? I'm sorry, I should have asked for that.
I'm trying to find if there's a good analysis, objective analysis on the risks of a natural disaster of any kind, earthquake, whatever, versus, and in addition of terrorists blowing a few holes in these thousands of miles of pipe. Okay, and that's
And
I think
David.
pipelines are just not very attractive targets. So pipelines have all sorts of shut-off valves. You spill oil on the surface and you get hideous environmental mess that's very local. And I think you have to put that in the context of other environmental damages. We are killing, name your number, 20, 30,000 people a year is a low-end number with fine particulate air pollution in this country. We are causing profound, long-lived climate changes that will last for literally thousands and tens of thousands of years through CO2 emissions. We're transforming the landscape in all sorts of ways through the way we do farming and various other energy sources. And on that context, if you sort of look, if you say to yourself you're going to have various measures of direct human health or climate or appropriation of land, those are three of the big measures. Measures of the energy system's impact on the environment. The fact is, oil spills on land, right, really low down.
Just add a small bit.
And as a terrorist target, compared to taking out parts of the electric power infrastructure, just really uninteresting because it's stored.
So what David says is right. There's a broader context that's also important to keep in mind. If the goal, let's say that there are legitimate fears about this or that mode of transporting oil. Then you have to ask if the particular tool you're using to shut that down reduces that risk or not. So if you are bottling up oil but not reducing your demand, and you're not going to get much demand reduction out because the price impact is small, then the oil is coming in some other way, and you have some other set of risks attached to that. And I think we've got to really keep that in mind, is that the goal, presumably, if you're worried about climate change, is to reduce our emissions of carbon dioxide, and so to reduce our use of fossil fuels in unabated ways, then you've got to go after the demand side of the equation, or else you're just moving that infrastructure around and causing a problem in a different place.
And what about?
Yeah, just say very quickly, a bunch of my neighbors are trying to get deals on big rail transport.
Yes.
And that rail is much worse per barrel in terms of health effects because of the diesel, all sorts of things. And so, again, if you do nothing else than just block Keystone, you might make things worse.
And what do you think in terms of perception and reality, timing? The Arkansas spill, again, actually Inside Climate News is all over that story as well. I mean, how does that influence the public gestalt on
Well,
this?
I'll take this because I think it speaks to the point I was trying to make Professor Keith
Yeah.
earlier. It opens the space to, the risk of the spill becoming the trade avenue, the conditions on this permit to
Yeah.
prevent another Mayflower. I think you got Bill Burton, former White House press secretary, working on this new all risk, no reward coalition, which is basically the same guys who have always opposed the pipeline. Now they're moving from climate back to safety. But again, this opens the space for the
Yeah.
practical
You're right.
conditions on the final permit. I will say, though, that comparing Pegasus, which was built in the 50s or something, to Keystone, is risking comparing apples and figs, honestly. I mean, Keystone is going to be coated with fusion bonded epoxy that's like state of the art. It's going to have a ton of precautions against a Mayflower situation that the Mayflower effect didn't have.
This also speaks to the disconnect between the United States and Canada. I had an utterly surreal experience on Canadian television a couple days after the Mayflower accident, where I was asked what I thought was a pretty silly question, but it made sense for a TV discussion. I was asked which side this helps. And I said, well, obviously it helps people who are opposed to the pipeline. I don't think it helps them much, because I think right now this is really a more oil or less oil and a bit of a political discussion. But of course it helps the people who are opposed to it. And the host says to me, and this is on a good television station, said, but doesn't this provide an opportunity for people to talk about how much better the Keystone pipeline is in terms of its safety?
Yeah.
So no. This is like the analog of we're
Yeah.
going to show you what's happening in the oil sands. When you have an oil spill, it's bad for people who want to produce more oil and transport it. End of story. But everyone is in their own little world on this,
That's a
and
great
these are the distorted ways that it gets through.
And as far as media coverage, I would say it incentivizes it to get worse, because it's real easy for an outfit like Inside Climate to go in there and say, Exxon is running the show, this means all oil is bad and all oil companies are bad, and that further incentivizes media to create this he said, she said, oil industry versus 350 frame that is not great.
And it has a visual
Yes.
of oil,
Yep.
neighborhoods, people, which, again, I guess, David, your comments about what real risks are versus smaller ones.
Depends on where you live.
For the particulate thing, how would you tell that story and dramatize it in the same way that it was hard to dramatize 2 parts per?
I've been arguing to some of the activists that they should, for climate, focus on closing down all U.S. coal plants in some fixed date. Whether or not they achieve that or not, who cares? But that would be something to be very clear, and they could spin a bunch of things about it. They could talk about the carbon impacts very easily, and I think there's ways to talk about it that are simple and direct. They could talk about the health impacts, and I think the way to talk about it is the fraction, the length of time you live. And to talk about the fact that the Clean Air Act and other reductions in air pollution have really made people live measurable amounts longer.
But how do you put a face on it? That's one of the problems with the media is the symbol, and something that's abstract and also happens over decades. People have said, about climate change, it's kind of like watching grass grow. It's harder to dramatize. So can you think of an image?
No question, that's true. I'm not the PR person who's good at thinking of images. I also think that we've become too obsessed and are assuming that people cannot do anything but respond to faces and images. And I actually have a little bit more faith in the public than that. I think that plain talk can get you somewhere. And I think that the idea that the only way to sell this is by putting some particular narrow face on it and then you'll get the deal is a strategy that's been tried for a long time. Maybe it's time to talk a little more honestly.
So I'm not making recommendations here for how people do these things, but I can imagine scenarios where this does get more attention, because you're right to say when the journalist wants to write about something, they say, okay, what's the story that I'm going to, what's the story? It's not some guy has an old study that still tells us that people will die. And on TV, you actually need a visual. But if we step back 2 years, the Keystone XL pipeline didn't have a particularly great visual. It didn't have much of a story. The people who wanted to focus on it created a story and a visual, in part so that it could get into the newspaper, and so that there could be a discussion. And there's no reason that the same kind of approach can't be applied in other places. And to be fair, let's say to the Sierra Club, they have a strategy heavily funded by Mike Bloomberg, similar to what you're talking about.
I think you missed the one part I would say on coal is I think you paint coal as Victorian. You really go after it as just the old thing. Our culture's obsessed with the new, and you have like visual images of people moving this black stuff, and pictures of it in people's minds, and you paint a picture of it as just this really old-fashioned thing that we should move beyond.
And Ilana, on that, and also maybe the language of tar versus oil, which was very concrete.
I've got attacked for using oil sands.
Yeah, and I've gotten attacked for using tar sands. But I think a big sign that the anti-pipeline side has effectively won the debate here is that now you see more mainstream outlets using tar sands and oil sands interchangeably. Whereas when I first started reporting on this, and what I told Chris's class and what I still believe is, tar sands is a pejorative term that was invented by opponents of its development.
And tar is a particular product of biofuels that is not what's in
not
here.
what's there. It's
Not to
tarry.
get out-
It has qualities of tar.
Yeah.
But
Not
it's
I
not
to
was
tar.
thinking of the black, the coal and the black and the Victorian and tar.
That's not oil either. So
Yeah.
Right,
Not to
so
get
what
too
is-
far into the weeds, but
Yeah.
tar sands is historically what has been called in the United States.
Yeah.
And oil sands is historically what has been called in Canada.
Yeah.
Not for any political reasons, because both have resources related to this. So there's not, I mean, it's obviously evolved because of the politics, but there's a really innocuous historical thing. Now, IHS Sierra tried to rename it the bitumen sands. That did not succeed.
Okay, yes, and then we'll
My
find
name
it.
is
Yeah.
Xi. I'm from the SIS School of Engineering and Applied Sciences. I have a question, maybe naive. If you build a pipeline to bridge the producer to the customer, I wonder if that will encourage the expansion of production of tar sands. If you produce more tar sands, which will have a higher carbon footprint, I think that will cause the increase of carbon emission, add more CO2 in the.
This is fantastic. This is a really great question.
I mean,
No.
all else equal. Okay, go.
All right,
No, we can both.
I'll
So-
wrestle on this one.
No,
No.
I don't think
I think
we
you need to
disagree.
think about it at two different levels.
Yeah.
So people talk about lock-in, is essentially what you're articulating. If you build this thing, doesn't mean that people will fill it with oil or whatever you want to call it, diluted bitumen, to violate one of the rules.
Dilbit.
Well, we know that.
Will it be filled? And frankly, if we reduce our demand for oil and prices crash, will we still be pumping stuff through this because it's there? And the answer is it depends on what actually comes from it. So the pipeline itself results in very little lock-in. If you amortize the pipeline over its lifetime, it's something like, pipeline transfer is like a couple bucks a barrel. And so the way to think about it is that once you've capitalized this thing, once you've built it, it gives you $2 worth of free services, essentially, or maybe a little less because they're operating expenses. $2 doesn't make a fundamental difference to whether you produce stuff on the other end or not. Your production decision is going to be dictated by the price of oil. Now, if having the pipeline there in the near term makes you confident enough to go and build production facilities, there is more of a lock-in effect because there is a decent upfront spend, and that's a big part of what gets you to these, whatever it is, $70, $80, $90 costs for adding new capacity in Canada, and the cost to continue that production once you've built it. And that's more like $40, $50, depending on the thing. So there are these differing degrees of lock-in. They're not fundamentally about the pipeline, but they are about how much near-term investment you get in Canadian production.
Because at the beginning you list the fact that the capacity of the pipeline is about 830,000 barrels per day, right? So you said the production rate is actually about 500,000 barrels per day. So I think the
No,
capacity.
the oil sands production is coming up towards 2 million barrels a day.
2 million. Okay.
And
they're
the
low.
number I
But-
said was actually
but-
they have less of those barrels under contract so far. That's the
Okay.
maximum capacity. They will eventually sign all those up.
Okay.
I think the bottom line is that fundamentally putting capital into developing oil sands, there's no question that if you were sort of rational about wanting to do the right thing on climate, you wouldn't do it. And in that broad sense, the answer is, if you care about climate, you should oppose it. But whether opposing Keystone in a narrow way, the way it's been done, it's an effective way to get climate policy, I think it's highly debatable.
And I just want to say one thing though on that front that relates to your question about how you dramatize this, because I mark my words, this is the next wave of the political fight over this. I wish it were, what Mike was saying, should we use more oil or less oil? I wish that were the debate. Instead, I think it's going to be about infrastructure. Because the same people who oppose Keystone, they're going to have less success making a national story. They're going to try to stop oil sands from going in the Portland-Montreal pipeline eventually to the East Coast. They're going to try to stop the expansion of the Alberta Clipper going through Wisconsin. They're going to try to stop coal export terminals. This is the infrastructure strategy. That some people liken it to whack-a-mole. So if I try to stop the infrastructure here, I'm hoping it doesn't pop up over there, but then I try to stop it over there. A lot of people think this is the new fight.
Yeah, for sure. And,
Last,
Yeah, okay, sorry. Yes, and then we're going to wind down here. Yeah. Yes,
This
go ahead.
doesn't follow, so why don't you go ahead?
I don't want to leave it at, this is obviously a rational thing to do if you care about climate change. I mean, once upon a time, a couple years ago, we thought about things like social cost of carbon and costs and benefits from different actions. And if you put a price on carbon that's at the 95th percentile of people's estimates for social cost of carbon, you would not shut down near-term oil sands investment. In the current world, with the oil demand we expect, even a rational approach from the United States and Canada to climate change doesn't necessarily shut down investment in oil sands. If we get to if we are globally able to reduce our oil demand, then that equation changes.
I don't think that's true, and I don't think that people actually sit on the money and calculate the people he says. And we can take it up later, but I think the bottom line is if you really did that, there would be reasonable, rational expectations from such a policy about what it would do to demand, and therefore to prices, and therefore to investment payback. And on a purely economic basis, those people aren't caring about environment, they care about making their money back. They would not invest. And so I think he's counting this in a very limited thing where the carbon price is only there and it doesn't affect, we don't have any effects of carbon price being imposed seriously in one country, affecting other countries' decisions, or affecting the future demand for oil through the transportation sector. I
This is
think
a great
under that
story.
narrow
Nobody else
lens,
right about
he's
it.
right. But under the larger lens, no way.
But I think we're talking about, and this is a whole other discussion for another time, but there's a separate question of what is the optimal world,
Yeah.
and what are the optimal decisions for individual countries to make
Agreed.
when they are not in that optimal world.
Yep.
And those are two different questions.
Agreed, but the
That-
way you
that's-
said it, which is if you put a high price up at third price, they'll name the number.
So, wait, we're gonna, I think we're either going to stay for an overnight and continue this, or we're going to wind down. Do you have a very quick
It's
comment?
extremely quick. I just wanted to mention that Harvard University subscribes to E&E News, so anyone with a Harvard ID card can access it. You know, there are about like 5 publications a day. And
Everyone.
They still have to.
Every day, every day.
Hooray!
So,
We're on
still-
Twitter,
they still have to
AE
buy the book.
Publishing.
You still have to buy the book.
so on that point, number one, I would really like to thank our speakers who have been amazing.